November 24th, 1944. Tokyo, Japan. Corporal Tanaka Hiroshi squinted through the optical rangefinder of his Type 88 75mm anti-aircraft gun as air raid sirens wailed across the capital. At 27,000 feet, the formation appeared, silver specks catching afternoon sunlight, engines trailing white contrails across clear sky. His crew had trained for this. Load, elevate, calculate wind drift and target altitude. Fire. The gun roared. The shell arced upward, fuse set for 27,500 feet, the maximum effective ceiling of Japan's primary heavy anti-aircraft weapon. Tanaka tracked the shell's trajectory through binoculars, waiting for the burst that would scatter the formation. The explosion bloomed thousands of feet below the bombers. He adjusted elevation to maximum, fired again. Another burst, lower than the targets. The B-29 superfortresses maintained formation at 31,000 feet, untouched, unreachable, as if operating in a dimension Japanese defenses couldn't penetrate. Tanaka's commander shouted coordinates, desperate calculations trying to bridge an altitude gap that physics wouldn't allow. What the Imperial Japanese Army had not anticipated was that American engineering had created not just a new bomber, but a weapon that rendered an entire nation's air defense system obsolete through a single specification: service ceiling 3,150 feet, beyond the reach of shells that burst harmlessly in empty sky below formations that bombed Japanese cities with impunity. The Pacific War was about to be decided not by courage or tactics, but by an altitude advantage measured in feet that might as well have been miles. Chapter 1. The Silver Fortress arrives. June 15th, 1944. Chengdu, China. Ground crews at the forward staging base heard the engines before they saw the aircraft. A deep, resonating thunder that shook the humid air across the improvised runway. 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, announced the arrival of something unprecedented in the Pacific theater. The B-29 Superfortress descended through scattered clouds, its 141-foot wingspan casting a shadow that dwarfed every aircraft on the field. Chinese laborers who'd spent months hand-building runways from crushed rock stopped working to stare. American mechanics familiar with B-17s and B-24s stood silent, calculating the engineering achievement represented by polished aluminum skin reflecting afternoon sun. The aircraft touched down with surprising grace despite its 60-ton weight. As it taxied toward the hardstand, details became visible that separated this bomber from everything that came before. The transparent plexiglass nose section revealed a pressurized cabin, technology that allowed crews to operate at extreme altitude without bulky oxygen masks and heated suits. Remote-controlled gun turrets eliminated the exposed waist gunner positions that made B-17 crews vulnerable to frostbite and hypoxia above 25,000 feet. Operation Matterhorn had begun. The plan called for B-29 staged from Chinese bases to strike Japanese industrial targets beyond the range of any previous Allied bomber. But 300 miles northwest, in Japanese-occupied territory, reconnaissance aircraft photographed the new arrivals with cameras designed to capture technical details from maximum safe distance. Within 48 hours, intelligence analysts in Tokyo received the images. They measured wingspan from photographic scale, estimated fuselage dimensions, counted engine nacelles. The numbers shouldn't have been possible for a 4-engine bomber. 141 feet wingspan suggested payload capacity far beyond existing heavy bombers. 4 massive radial engines implied power-to-weight ratios that American engineering shouldn't have achieved. The real concern emerged when analysts calculated performance specifications from observed takeoff distance and climb rate. Maximum altitude estimates reached 31,000 feet, perhaps higher. Maximum speed approached 350 miles per hour. Bomb load capacity exceeded 20,000 pounds, 10 tons of ordnance delivered at altitudes where Japanese interceptors struggled to maintain formation. Japanese High Command ordered immediate defensive preparations. Type 88 75mm anti-aircraft batteries received priority deployment around critical industrial targets. Fighter squadrons transferred from China campaigns to homeland defense. Radar stations expanded coverage to provide maximum warning time. The orders reflected confidence that existing defenses could adapt. Japanese engineers had designed the Type 88 specifically for high-altitude defense, with theoretical maximum ceiling of 27,500 feet. Fighter aircraft, Kawasaki Ki-61, Tony, and Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo, had service ceilings exceeding 32,000 feet on paper. But specifications calculated on engineering diagrams didn't account for combat reality. Anti-aircraft shells required precise fusing to detonate at target altitude. At 27,500 feet, the Type 88 reached its absolute performance limit. Shells climbed with decreasing velocity, trajectories became unpredictable, fuses struggled with thin air and temperature extremes. Fighter aircraft faced worse constraints. Paper specifications assumed clean configurations, optimal fuel loads, sea-level maintenance standards. Combat-loaded fighters at 30,000 feet operated in atmospheric zones, where engines gasped for oxygen, controls responded sluggishly, pilots fought hypoxia despite supplemental oxygen systems. One engineer reviewing the intelligence photographs recognized the fatal gap. If B-29 specifications were accurate, service ceiling 31,850 feet, then Japanese defenses faced mathematical impossibility. The altitude difference wasn't marginal. 4,000 feet separated effective. Defensive ceiling from bomber operational altitude. 4,000 feet might as well have been 4,000 miles. The first raid was scheduled for June 16th. Yawata Steelworks on Kyushu Island, a target chosen specifically to announce American capability. 68 B-29s would attack from altitudes Japanese gunners had never engaged, dropping bombs from atmospheric zones where defenders could only watch and calculate trajectories that physics wouldn't allow. Chapter 2. Yawata. The First Strike. The first raid was scheduled for June 16th. Yawata Steelworks on Kyushu Island, a target chosen specifically to announce American capability. 68 B-29s would attack from altitudes Japanese gunners had never engaged, dropping bombs from atmospheric zones where defenders could only watch and calculate trajectories that physics wouldn't allow. June 15, 1944, 68 B-29. Superfortresses lifted from Chinese runways at Chengdu, each carrying 2 tons of 500-pound bombs, across 1,600 miles of occupied territory toward Japan's most important steel facility. The Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata produced 24% of Japan's rolled steel, the backbone of warship construction, tank manufacturing, munitions production. The bombers climbed steadily through darkness, Wright R-3350 engines pulling them through 20,000 feet, 25,000, 30,000. Inside pressurized cabins, crews operated in shirt sleeves, while outside temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Navigation lights extinguished. Formation spacing widened to reduce collision risk in darkness. Each aircraft would bomb individually. Fuel constraints prevented formation flying across such distances. At 00:38 local time, June 16th, the first B-29 arrived over Yawata at 30,000 feet. Air raid sirens wailed across the city. Blackout procedures implemented months earlier plunged industrial districts into darkness. Smoke generators activated, adding artificial haze to natural humidity. The defensive measures followed doctrine developed against conventional bombers attacking at 20 to 25,000 feet. But these bombers weren't at 25,000 feet. Type 88 75mm batteries positioned around the steelworks opened fire. Crews elevated barrels to maximum angle, loaded shells fused for 27,500 feet, and fired at targets invisible above searchlight beams. The guns roared. Shells arced upward, trailing smoke visible in searchlight glare. The explosions bloomed 3,000 feet below the B-29 formations. Gunners adjusted fuses, recalculated trajectories, fired again. More bursts, all too low. The mathematics were unforgiving. Shells climbing to their maximum ceiling arrived with insufficient velocity to maintain accurate trajectories. Fuses designed for thicker air at lower altitudes struggled with temperature and pressure extremes at 27,000 feet. The defensive barrage that should have torn formations apart detonated harmlessly in empty sky, while bombers cruised overhead, untouched, unreachable. Fighter interceptors scrambled from air bases across Kyushu. Kawasaki Ki-61, Tony, and Nakajima Ki-44. Tojo fighters climbed toward the threat. Pilots pushing throttles forward, coaxing maximum performance from engines designed for lower altitude combat. On paper, both types had service ceilings exceeding 32,000 feet. Combat reality proved different. At 25,000 feet, engine power began dropping noticeably. At 28,000, controls responded sluggishly as thin air reduced aerodynamic effectiveness. At 30,000 feet, pilots fought hypoxia despite oxygen masks as their bodies struggled with pressure altitude equivalent to mountain peaks. The few fighters reaching bomber altitude couldn't maintain formation, couldn't execute intercept geometry, couldn't sustain engagement. The 4th Air Regiment managed one kill, a B-29 damaged by anti-aircraft fire, struggling with engine trouble at lower altitude where fighters could engage effectively. The other interceptors achieved few contacts. Most couldn't reach operational altitude. Those that did found bombers cruising comfortably in pressurized cabins, while Japanese pilots fought consciousness in unpressurized cockpits at extreme altitude. 47 B-29s dropped bombs on Yawata that night. 32 bombed by radar through clouds and smoke. 15 achieved visual aim points. The results disappointed American planners. Only one bomb struck the Imperial Iron and Steel Works complex, hitting a powerhouse 3,700 feet from the target coke ovens. Light damage scattered across Yawata. The raid's tactical effectiveness was minimal, but the strategic message was unmistakable. Japanese commanders reviewing the night's defensive performance confronted uncomfortable mathematics. The 131st Anti-Aircraft Regiment had fired hundreds of shells, achieving 0 confirmed hits. Fighter interceptors had launched dozens of sorties, scoring 1 kill against a crippled bomber at reduced altitude. The defensive system, guns, fighters, radar, early warning, had been designed for threats operating at 20 to 25,000 feet. The B-29s operated at 30,000 feet and higher. That 5,000-foot gap represented technological obsolescence that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. Type 88. Guns couldn't reach targets beyond their maximum effective ceiling. Fighter aircraft couldn't maintain sustained combat at altitudes where engines lost power and pilots fought hypoxia. Radar stations had detected the raid but couldn't determine bomber altitude with sufficient accuracy for effective intercept geometry. 7 B-29s were lost in the operation, 5 to mechanical failures and accidents, 2 to enemy action. The loss rate was acceptable, sustainable. American planners recognized they'd found a weapon Japan couldn't effectively counter with existing defenses. Tokyo headquarters received reports with growing alarm. More raids were coming. The Americans had demonstrated both capability and intent, and Japan had no immediate solution to aircraft operating in atmospheric zones their defenses physically could not reach. The altitude gap wasn't tactical, it was existential, and it would define every raid that followed until Japan's surrender 15 months later. Chapter 3. The Engineering Marvel. The altitude gap wasn't tactical, it was existential, and it would define every raid that followed until Japan's surrender 15 months later. But that gap hadn't occurred by accident. 4 years earlier and 6,000 miles away, Boeing engineers in Seattle faced requirements that pushed 1940s aeronautical technology to its absolute limits. February 1940. The Army Air Corps issued specifications for a bomber unlike anything that existed, capable of carrying a maximum bomb load of 2,000 pounds at 400 miles per hour across a distance of at least 5,000 miles. The requirements were intentionally extreme. Planners envisioned a bomber that could strike any target from distant bases, independent of forward airfields that might not exist when war came. Boeing, Consolidated, Douglas, and Lockheed submitted design proposals. The Army examined all 4 but found Boeing's approach most promising. In September 1940, 15 months before Pearl Harbor, the Army issued contracts for 2 flyable prototypes. 8 months later, in April 1941, a production order followed. 250 aircraft plus spare parts equivalent to another 25 bombers. The confidence was extraordinary. Boeing hadn't built a prototype. The Army was ordering mass production of an aircraft that existed only as engineering drawings. But the specifications demanded innovations that couldn't be tested incrementally. Either the technologies worked together as a complete system, or the entire program failed. The primary challenge was altitude. Existing bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress operated effectively at 20 to 25,000 feet. Crews wore oxygen masks and heated suits to survive temperatures that reached 40 degrees below zero. But higher altitude offered safety. Anti-aircraft fire grew less accurate above 25,000 feet, and most fighter interceptors struggled to maintain combat performance above 30,000 feet. Boeing's solution was revolutionary: fully pressurized crew compartments. The flight deck forward of the wing, the gunner's compartment aft of the wing, and the tail gunner's station would maintain cabin pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet altitude even when the aircraft flew at 30,000 feet or higher. Crews could operate in shirt sleeves without oxygen masks, maintaining alertness and efficiency that unpressurized fighters couldn't match. The engineering challenges were immense. Pressurization required seamless fuselage construction. Any leak compromised the system. It demanded reliable air compressors driven by engine power. It needed pressure relief valves that prevented overpressurization during rapid altitude changes. And it required a connecting tunnel between forward and aft crew sections that maintained pressure integrity while allowing crew movement. Wright Aeronautical Corporation developed the R3350 duplex Cyclone engine specifically for the B-29, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows, producing 2,200 horsepower each. General Electric designed turbo superchargers that maintained engine power at extreme altitude by compressing thin air before it entered cylinders. 4 engines generated combined power exceeding 8,800 horsepower, more than any aircraft in existence. The defensive armament system represented another breakthrough. Remote-controlled gun turrets eliminated exposed waist gunner positions. A central fire control system used analog computers to calculate lead angles and trajectories, allowing one gunner to control multiple turrets simultaneously. 5 turrets mounted 12 50-caliber machine guns. 4 turrets on the fuselage, 1 in the tail. A fire control officer in the barber's chair could direct concentrated firepower against attackers from any angle. September 21, 1942. The prototype XB-29 lifted from Boeing Field in Seattle on its first flight. Test pilot Edmund T. Allen reported that the aircraft handled well despite its size. Wingspan 141 feet 3 inches, length 99 feet, empty weight 74,500 pounds. The pressurization system worked as designed. The engines delivered promised power. The remote-controlled guns responded to fire control inputs, but problems emerged immediately. The Wright R3350 engines overheated during ground operations and high-power climbs. Insufficient airflow through engine cowlings caused cylinders to overheat, igniting residual oil and causing fires. The issue plagued the program throughout development and persisted into combat operations. Modifications helped, improved baffling, redesigned cowlings, better cooling procedures, but the R3350 remained problematic until war's end. Production delays mounted. The pressurized fuselage required manufacturing techniques that existing factories didn't have. Workers needed specialized training. Quality control had to catch pressurization leaks that would have been acceptable on conventional bombers. Engine reliability problems forced modifications on aircraft already rolling off assembly lines. The cost escalated beyond anyone's projections. Each B-29 carried a price tag of $639,000, 3 times the cost of a B-17 Flying Fortress. The entire program consumed $3 billion, exceeding the $1.9 billion spent on the Manhattan Project that developed atomic weapons. But when B-29s finally reached combat in June 1944, the engineering investment paid immediate dividends. Japanese anti-aircraft guns literally could not reach bombers cruising at 30,000 feet. Fighter interceptors struggled to engage targets at altitudes where American crews operated comfortably in pressurized cabins. The altitude advantage wasn't marginal improvement over existing bombers. It was decisive technological superiority that rendered enemy defenses obsolete. Yet even as the first B-29s struck Japan from Chinese bases, production problems continued. Engine fires destroyed aircraft on the ground. Manufacturing bottlenecks delayed deliveries. Crews required extensive training to operate the most complex bomber ever built. And the Pacific War was intensifying. Every month of delay meant more months before strategic bombing could devastate Japanese war production. The race was on to deploy enough superfortresses before Japan could develop defenses capable of countering the altitude advantage that Boeing's engineers had created. Chapter 4. Japan's Defensive Gap. The race was on to deploy enough superfortresses before Japan could develop defenses capable of countering the altitude advantage that Boeing's engineers had created. But in Tokyo, Imperial Japanese Army Air Defense Command already understood they faced a crisis that courage alone couldn't solve. Summer 1944. Japanese military analysts reviewing reconnaissance photographs and combat reports from the Yawata raid confronted technical specifications that revealed mathematical impossibility. The B-29 superfortress operated at altitudes their defensive systems simply could not reach. Japan's primary heavy anti-aircraft weapon, the Type 88 75mm gun, had entered service in 1932, 12 years before the B-29's combat debut. Engineers had designed it specifically for high-altitude defense against strategic bombers. Its effective ceiling of 27,500 feet represented cutting-edge capability in the early 1930s, adequate for intercepting any bomber in existence. But B-29s cruised at 31,000 feet. The 4,000-foot gap wasn't a minor tactical disadvantage. It was absolute physical limitation. Anti-aircraft artillery faced constraints that no amount of training or determination could overcome. Shells climbed through progressively thinner air, losing velocity as atmospheric resistance decreased, but gravitational pull remained constant. Fuses designed to detonate at specific altitudes struggled with temperature and pressure extremes at the gun's maximum ceiling. Trajectories became increasingly unpredictable as shells reached the upper limits of their ballistic arcs. At 27,500 feet, Type 88 shells arrived with barely enough energy to burst. Above that altitude, physics rendered the weapon useless. Gunners could elevate barrels to maximum angle, could calculate lead perfectly, could time fuses with precision, and still watch their shells explode harmlessly thousands of feet below targets they literally could not reach. Japan did possess newer weapons with higher theoretical ceilings. The Type 99 88mm gun, introduced in 1939, could theoretically engage targets at 29,500 feet, still 1,500 feet below B-29 cruise altitude. The Type 5 120mm gun, Japan's most powerful anti-aircraft weapon, had design specifications claiming ceiling of 32,800 feet. But specifications on engineering diagrams didn't translate to combat effectiveness. Type 99 production remained limited. Industrial capacity prioritized fighter aircraft and naval vessels over anti-aircraft guns. Type 5 production totaled 121 guns for the entire Japanese home islands by war's end. Even where deployed, both weapons lacked effective radar fire control systems that Allied guns used to calculate trajectories automatically. Japanese gunners relied on optical rangefinders and manual calculations against targets operating at extreme altitude. Fighter aircraft faced identical constraints. On paper, Japanese interceptors had impressive service ceilings. The Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony was rated at 37,000 feet. The Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo at 36,500 feet. Even the Mitsubishi A6M0, designed as carrier fighter, not high-altitude interceptor, could theoretically reach 33,000 feet. Combat reality differed drastically from manufacturer specifications. Those ceiling ratings assumed clean aircraft configuration, no external weapons, minimal fuel load, optimal engine condition maintained by factory-fresh maintenance. Combat-loaded fighters carrying ammunition, sufficient fuel for sustained engagement, and operating with engines stressed by months of service barely reached 30,000 feet. More critically, reaching altitude wasn't the same as fighting at altitude. At 30,000 feet, aircraft operated in atmospheric conditions that pushed 1940s piston engines to their absolute limits. Air density dropped to roughly 30% of sea level values. Engines gasped for oxygen, producing fraction of their rated horsepower. Controls responded sluggishly as thin air reduced aerodynamic effectiveness. Pilots fought hypoxia despite oxygen masks. Human bodies struggled with pressure altitude equivalent to Earth's highest mountains. B-29 crews experienced none of these constraints. Pressurized cabins maintained comfortable 8,000-foot equivalent altitude. Crews operated alert and efficient in shirt sleeves, while Japanese pilots 2 miles below fought consciousness in freezing, unpressurized cockpits. Wright R-33 Phi engines, with General Electric turbo superchargers, maintained power output that Japanese radial engines couldn't match at extreme altitude. The defensive gap extended beyond individual weapons to systemic capability. Japanese early warning radar could detect incoming formations, but couldn't determine altitude with precision necessary for effective intercept geometry. Ground controllers vectoring fighters toward targets operated with incomplete information. By the time interceptors climbed to estimated bomber altitude, formations had already passed over target areas and begun descending towards safer medium altitudes where fighter engagement became possible. One staff officer summarized the situation in a classified report to Tokyo headquarters. American technological advantage in altitude performance has rendered our defensive systems obsolete. We face enemy operating in atmospheric zones where our weapons physically cannot function effectively. Industrial capacity does not exist to produce sufficient quantities of improved weapons before strategic bombing devastates war production. The analysis was brutally accurate. Japan's industrial base in 1944 struggled to maintain fighter aircraft production, replace naval losses, manufacture munitions for ground forces fighting across the Pacific. Retooling factories to mass-produce Type 5 anti-aircraft guns or develop new high-altitude interceptors would require years Japan didn't have and resources that didn't exist. Meanwhile, 6,000 miles east across the Pacific, American engineers solved the final challenge that had delayed B-29 deployment: constructing massive air bases on recently captured islands in the Marianas Chain. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam lay 1,500 miles from Tokyo, well within B-29 range. Unlike Chinese bases supplied by dangerous flights over the Himalayas, Marianas airfields could receive cargo ships carrying unlimited fuel, bombs, spare parts. The 20th Air Force was about to escalate strategic bombing from sporadic raids by dozens of aircraft to sustained campaigns by hundreds of superfortresses, striking Japan with impunity from altitudes where defenders could only watch shells burst uselessly in empty sky below. Chapter 5. The Marianas. Impunity. The 20th Air Force was about to escalate strategic bombing from sporadic raids by dozens of aircraft to sustained campaigns by hundreds of superfortresses, striking Japan with impunity from altitudes where defenders could only watch shells burst uselessly in empty sky below. November 24, 1944. 111 B-29. Superfortresses lifted from runways on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The first mass formation raid launched from the Marianas Islands against Tokyo. The target, Nakajima Aircraft Company plant at Musashino, producing engines for Japanese fighter aircraft. The bombers climbed to 30,000 feet, formation tightening as they approached Japanese airspace. Inside pressurized cabins, crews monitored instruments, adjusted oxygen flow through backup systems, confirmed bomb release mechanisms. The Wright R-3350 engines settled into steady drone that would carry formations across 1,500 miles of Pacific Ocean to targets American planners had been unable to strike since the Doolittle raid 2.5 years earlier. Japanese early warning radar detected the formation 150 miles from Tokyo. Air raid sirens wailed across the capital. Type 88 batteries elevated barrels to maximum angle. Fighter squadrons scrambled from airfields across the Kanto Plain. The defensive response followed protocols refined through months of high-altitude raids, but protocols that had never succeeded in stopping B-29 formations. The anti-aircraft barrage began as lead bombers approached the initial point. Hundreds of shells arced upward, fuses set for 27,500 feet, the maximum ceiling of Japan's primary defensive weapon. The familiar pattern repeated, explosions blooming 3,000 feet below formations that cruised untouched at 30,000 feet and higher. Gunners fired until ammunition ran low, watching helplessly as bomber after bomber passed overhead beyond reach. The mathematical impossibility hadn't changed since Yawata 5 months earlier. Japanese shells physically could not reach altitudes where B-29s operated. The defensive barrage that should have shredded formations instead detonated harmlessly in empty sky, creating spectacular but useless display of pyrotechnics that illuminated American advantage with brutal clarity. Fighter interceptors fared marginally better. Kawasaki Ki-61. Tony fighters from the 244th Sentai managed to engage formations at 28,000 feet, still 2,000 feet below optimal bombing altitude but close enough for deflection shots against stragglers. One B-29 fell to fighter attack, another damaged severely enough to ditch in the Pacific during return flight. But most interceptors never reached engagement altitude. Those that did struggled with performance degradation in thin air. Pilots pushed throttles forward, coaxing maximum power from engines designed for lower altitude combat, and found their aircraft wallowing through atmospheric soup where controls responded slowly, where rate of climb dropped to barely sustainable levels, where consciousness itself became battle against hypoxia. B-29 crews operated comfortably in pressurized cabins maintaining 8,000-foot equivalent pressure. They drank coffee, monitored instruments without oxygen masks restricting movement, maintained alertness that Japanese pilots fighting hypoxia at 30,000 feet simply couldn't match. The technological gap extended beyond altitude performance to human factors that determined combat effectiveness. The raid achieved mixed results. Cloud cover obscured the primary target. Only 24 bombers hit the Nakajima plant. Others bombed alternates or targets of opportunity. 2 B-29s were lost to enemy action, 3 to mechanical failures. The loss rate of approximately 4.5% was sustainable dramatically, lower than European theater bomber casualties where German flak and fighters routinely destroyed 8 to 10% of attacking formations. Over following months, the campaign intensified. The 73rd Bombardment Wing on Saipan was joined by the 313th, 314th, 58th, and 315th Wings as more B-29s arrived from American factories. By March 1945, formations of 100 to 200 superfortresses struck Japan weekly, then daily, operating from airstrips carved from coral and jungle on islands captured at horrific cost months earlier. Japanese defenders continued firing thousands of shells per raid. Type 88 batteries exhausted ammunition stocks trying to reach targets beyond their physical capability. Type 99 88mm guns, theoretically capable of engaging at 29,500 feet, achieved marginally better results but still operated below B-29 cruise altitude. The rare Type 5 120mm guns that could theoretically reach 32,800 feet were too few and lacked radar fire control systems necessary for effective high-altitude engagement. The psychological impact of helplessness bred desperation. Japanese civilians watched silver formations pass overhead in daylight, trailing white contrails, dropping bombs from altitudes where defensive fire exploded harmlessly below. The spectacle demonstrated technological obsolescence with clarity that no propaganda could disguise. American bombers operated in atmospheric zones Japanese defenses physically could not reach. Yet tactical success didn't translate to strategic devastation planners anticipated. High-altitude precision bombing from 30,000 feet proved far less accurate than expected. Jet stream winds at extreme altitude, discovered during B-29 operations and poorly understood in 1944, pushed formations off course. Cloud cover obscured targets. Radar bombing achieved poor accuracy. Many raids inflicted minimal damage despite hundreds of bombers dropping thousands of tons of ordnance. General Curtis LeMay, assuming command of Westwing Bomber Command in January 1945, reviewed operational data with growing frustration. B-29s were designed for high-altitude precision bombing. They possessed altitude advantage that rendered Japanese defenses ineffective. But that advantage wasn't destroying Japanese war production at rates necessary to force surrender. The analysis led to radical decision that would redefine the strategic bombing campaign and voluntarily surrender the altitude advantage that had kept American crews safe for 8 months of operations from the Marianas. Chapter 6. LeMay's Decision. The analysis led to radical decision that would redefine the strategic bombing campaign and voluntarily surrender the altitude advantage that had kept American crews safe for 8 months of operations from the Marianas. March 1945, Guam. Major General Curtis LeMay reviewed operational reports with mounting frustration. 4. Months of high-altitude precision bombing from the Marianas had failed to achieve strategic objectives. B-29s possessed altitude advantage that rendered Japanese defenses ineffective. Crews operated safely at 30,000 feet, while Japanese gunners fired uselessly at targets beyond reach. But safety didn't equal effectiveness. Cloud cover obscured targets two-thirds of bombing days. Jet stream winds at extreme altitude, phenomena poorly understood in 1944, pushed formations off course, scattering bombs across wide areas. Radar bombing achieved minimal accuracy against precision targets. Hundreds of bombers dropping thousands of tons of ordnance inflicted damage that was real, but insufficient to devastate Japanese war production. LeMay recognized fundamental mismatch between aircraft capability and strategic requirement. B-29s were designed for high-altitude precision strikes against concentrated industrial targets, factories, refineries, marshalling yards. But Japanese war production wasn't concentrated. Small workshops dispersed throughout urban residential areas manufactured components that larger factories assembled into finished weapons. Traditional precision bombing couldn't destroy distributed manufacturing systems embedded in civilian neighborhoods. The solution violated doctrine, surrendered the altitude advantage Boeing's engineers had created, and accepted casualties that high-altitude operations avoided. But LeMay's analysis concluded it was necessary. Low-level incendiary raids at 5,000 to 8,000 feet against Japanese cities, constructed primarily of wood and paper. M69 napalm cluster bombs designed to create firestorms that would consume not just factories, but entire urban industrial districts where war production occurred. The tactical shift brought B-29s within effective range of Japanese anti-aircraft guns and fighter interceptors. The altitude advantage that had kept American casualties to 5% would be voluntarily surrendered. But destruction, not survival, became the priority. March 9, 1945, 17:35 local time. 325 B-29 superfortresses began launching from Saipan and Guam for Operation Meeting House, the first mass low-level incendiary raid against Tokyo. The bombers carried no defensive ammunition for most guns, stripping weight to maximize incendiary payload. Each aircraft loaded 7 tons of M69 cluster bombs, 500-pound clusters containing 38 napalm-filled bomblets that ignited 3 to 5 seconds after impact. The formation approached Tokyo after midnight, descending to 5,000 to 7,000 feet. Pathfinder aircraft marked the target area with incendiaries arranged in giant X pattern across Tokyo's Shitamachi district, the working-class neighborhood near docks where population density exceeded 1 million people per 4 square miles. Japanese radar operators struggled to understand what they detected. B-29s operating at low altitude violated every pattern established over 8 months of high-altitude raids. Early warnings went unheeded. Controllers assumed radar contacts at 7,000 feet were technical errors or reconnaissance flights. The first alarm sounded at 0015 after lead bombers had already begun dropping incendiaries. Type 88 anti-aircraft batteries that couldn't reach 30,000-foot formations suddenly found targets within effective range. Searchlights illuminated bombers cruising barely a mile above ground. Shells that had exploded uselessly below high-altitude formations now burst among attacking aircraft. Japanese gunners achieved what had been impossible for months: direct hits on B-29s flying through altitude zones where defensive fire was lethal. Fighter interceptors scrambled with better prospects than they'd faced since Yawata. 7,000 feet was well within operational envelope of Kawasaki Ki-61 and Nakajima Ki-44 fighters. No hypoxia, no engine power loss, no sluggish controls in thin air. But coordination collapsed. Ground controllers provided no guidance. Fighters and anti-aircraft batteries operated without coordination. Interceptors prowled coastlines searching for contacts they never found. The incendiaries fell across Shitamachi in systematic pattern. Each M69 cluster broke apart at 2,000 feet, scattering 38 napalm bomblets across wide area. The bomblets punched through wooden roofing or landed in narrow streets, igniting seconds later with white phosphorus charges that expelled jets of flaming napalm. Within 2 hours, individual fires coalesced into general conflagration covering 15.8 square miles. Surface winds gusting at 45 to 67 miles per hour from southwest fanned flames through neighborhoods where houses constructed of wood and paper offered no resistance. Fire breaks didn't exist. Traditional Japanese urban planning favored dense construction, where buildings pressed together along narrow alleys. Firefighting equipment proved inadequate against firestorm that overwhelmed Tokyo's limited civil defense infrastructure. Approximately 100,000 people died that night. 1 million were left homeless. 16 square miles of Tokyo burned, more destruction than Dresden, Hamburg, or either atomic bombing as single events. Operation Meeting House became the deadliest air raid in human history. 14 B-29s were lost to enemy action, 12 to anti-aircraft fire, none to fighters despite 210 Japanese interceptors airborne. 42 bombers sustained damage, 2 written off after landing. 96 American airmen killed or missing, 6 wounded. The loss rate of 4.3% represented 3 times typical high-altitude casualties. But the devastation achieved what 8 months of precision bombing hadn't. An entire urban industrial district destroyed in single night. War production capacity scattered through residential neighborhoods, eliminated wholesale. Strategic bombing's effectiveness finally matched its resource investment. LeMay reported results to Washington with brutal clarity. Low-level incendiary tactics worked. The altitude advantage that had protected crews was unnecessary if targets could be destroyed faster than Japanese defenses could inflict prohibitive casualties. Better to lose 14 bombers destroying 16 square miles than lose 2 bombers accomplishing minimal damage. The moral calculus was inescapable. Trading American lives for Japanese civilians. Accepting area bombing, what critics called terror bombing, as legitimate strategy. Deliberately creating firestorms that killed tens of thousands of non-combatants to destroy distributed war production embedded in residential neighborhoods. LeMay later summarized his reasoning with characteristic bluntness. If we lose the war, we'll all be tried as war criminals. If we win the war, our actions will be justified by victory. The altitude advantage that Boeing engineers designed to protect crews had been voluntarily surrendered because destruction mattered more than safety. Operation Meeting House established a pattern that would define the final 5 months of the Pacific War. Incendiary raids against urban industrial centers, low-altitude tactics sacrificing safety for effectiveness, systematic devastation of Japanese cities until surrender or invasion became necessary, and culminating in August with 2 B-29s, Enola Gay and Boxcar, climbing back to 30,000 feet to drop weapons that made incendiary raids obsolete and forced Japan's unconditional surrender. Chapter 7. August 1945. The Final Altitude. And culminating in August with 2 B-29s, Enola Gay and Boxcar, climbing back to 30,000 feet to drop weapons that made incendiary raids obsolete and forced Japan's unconditional surrender. August 6, 1945, 02:45 local time. A specially modified B-29 Superfortress, designated 44-86292, named Enola Gay after the pilot's mother, lifted from North Field on Tinian Island. The aircraft was one of 15 silver-plate B-29s, extensively modified for a single purpose: delivering atomic weapons. The modifications transformed standard heavy bombers into specialized platforms. Defensive armament stripped away, only tailguns remained. 7,200 pounds of armor plating removed, additional fuel tanks installed in rear bomb bay, quick-acting pneumatic bomb bay doors replaced standard mechanisms. Wright R-3350-41 fuel-injected engines provided improved reliability and performance. The weight reductions and engine upgrades enabled silverplate B-29s to fly higher and faster than standard production aircraft. Colonel Paul Tibbets commanded Enola Gay. Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee would aim the weapon. Navy Captain William Parsons would arm it in flight. The bomb designated Little Boy was too dangerous to arm on the ground. The 10,000-pound uranium weapon represented 3 years of Manhattan Project research, $1.9 billion in development costs, and destructive power equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The bomber climbed to 31,000 feet, cruising altitude where crews operated comfortably in pressurized cabin, while engines maintained power through supercharged compression. The same altitude advantage that had protected B-29 formations for 13 months now served different purpose: safety from the weapon's own blast effects. Calculations predicted thermal radiation and shock wave would require minimum 8 miles separation between aircraft and detonation point. At 0809, Enola Gay approached Hiroshima from the south. Air raid sirens had sounded earlier when weather reconnaissance aircraft passed overhead, then fell silent after it departed. Few civilians sought shelter when a single B-29 appeared. Lone bombers typically indicated reconnaissance, not attack. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries tracked the aircraft through optical rangefinders. Crews elevated Type 88 75mm guns to maximum angle. Loaded shells fused for 27,500 feet, fired at the solitary bomber cruising 4,000 feet above their effective ceiling. The shells burst harmlessly below, the same futile pattern that had repeated through hundreds of raids since Yawata 15 months earlier. At 08:15:17, Farabee released Little Boy from 31,600 feet. The bomb fell for 43 seconds. Tibbets executed violent diving turn, dropping altitude and banking sharply to maximize distance from detonation point. At 08:16, the weapon detonated 1,900 feet above Shima Surgical Clinic near the center of Hiroshima. The fireball measured 900 feet in diameter, surface temperature exceeding 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Thermal radiation ignited everything combustible within a 2-mile radius. The shockwave, traveling at over 700 miles per hour, demolished buildings across 4.4 square miles. Approximately 70,000 people died instantly. By year's end, radiation effects would claim another 70,000. Enola Gay, 11 miles from detonation, felt shockwave as visible ripples in air that rattled the aircraft. Tailgunner Bob Karen reported mushroom cloud rising to 30,000 feet, boiling upward through altitude zones where B-29s operated. The city below burned in firestorm visible 140 miles away. 3 days passed. August 9th, 1945. Boxcar, another silver plate B-29 serial number 4427297, carried the second atomic weapon, Fat Man, a plutonium implosion device weighing 10,800 pounds. The primary target was Kokura Arsenal. Cloud cover obscured the city through 3 bombing runs. Major Charles Sweeney diverted to secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02, Bombardier Captain Kermit Behan released Fat Man from 28,900 feet. The weapon detonated 1,600 feet above the Urakami Valley. Yield: 21 kilotons, 40% more powerful than Little Boy. The valley's topography channeled blast effects along its length, while surrounding hills shielded portions of Nagasaki from direct effects. Approximately 40,000 killed instantly, another 25,000 injured. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries fired at Boxcar with identical futility as they'd fired at Enola Gay 3 days earlier. Shells burst thousands of feet below the bomber, cruising beyond effective range of weapons designed a decade earlier for threats operating at lower altitudes. The altitude gap that had defined the strategic bombing campaign now enabled delivery of weapons that rendered conventional bombing obsolete. August 15th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender in radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese citizens heard the emperor's voice. The announcement cited a new and most cruel bomb as justification for accepting Allied surrender terms. 2 atomic weapons delivered by aircraft Japan's defenses literally could not reach had achieved what firebombing of 67 cities and naval blockade hadn't: immediate capitulation. The technological advantage that began with pressurized cabins and supercharged engines, innovations designed to protect crews through altitude performance, culminated in mushroom clouds rising from cities bombed by aircraft, flying where defenders watched helplessly as shells burst uselessly below formations, operating beyond physical reach of defensive systems designed for conventional warfare. The altitude gap measured in feet translated to strategic dominance measured in total victory. B-29s operating at 31,000 feet had proven immune to Japanese defenses throughout the Pacific War. That immunity enabled systematic destruction of Japanese cities through incendiary raids, and finally enabled delivery of weapons so devastating that a single bomb destroyed entire city, rendering further resistance meaningless. The altitude advantage Boeing engineers created in 1940 to protect bomber crews had evolved into capability that changed warfare permanently. Nuclear weapons required delivery platforms that could operate beyond range of defensive systems. B-29s provided that capability through pressure altitude advantage that Japanese anti-aircraft guns and fighter interceptors never overcame. Corporal Tanaka Hiroshi, the anti-aircraft gunner from Tokyo whose crew had fired uselessly at B-29 formations since November 1944, survived the war. In captured diary entries, he described the bitter mathematics. "We fired until our barrels glowed red. We calculated trajectories with precision our instructors praised. We maintained discipline under bombardment. But the enemy flew at heights our weapons could not reach. Courage meant nothing. Training meant nothing. The altitude gap could not be bridged by warrior spirit. We lost because American engineering created capability we could not match." The B-29's service ceiling of 31,850 feet, a specification that seemed modest compared to pressures on designers to maximize every performance parameter, had proven decisive. 4,000 feet separated Japanese defensive ceiling from American operational altitude. That gap, measured in atmospheric zones where physics determined what weapons could achieve, decided the Pacific War as surely as any battle. Chapter 8. The Altitude Paradox. The B-29's service ceiling of 31,850 feet, a specification that seemed modest compared to pressures on designers to maximize every performance parameter, had proven decisive. 4,000 feet separated Japanese defensive ceiling from American operational altitude. That gap, measured in atmospheric zones where physics determined what weapons could achieve, decided the Pacific War as surely as any battle. But victory carried weight that statistics couldn't measure. 1945-1950, B-29 crews returned home carrying memories that would haunt some for decades. They'd operated at altitudes where Japanese defenses literally could not reach. Loss rates averaging 5%, dramatically lower than European theater bomber casualties, where German flak and fighters routinely destroyed 8 to 10% of attacking formations. Safety at 30,000 feet. Yet that same safety enabled systematic destruction of Japanese cities. Between November 1944 and August 1945, B-29s dropped 170,000 tons of bombs on Japan. Incendiary raids devastated 67 cities. Operation Meeting House alone killed 100,000 people in a single night. The atomic bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, delivered from 31,000 feet, killed over 200,000 by year's end. Technical Sergeant Jacob DeShazer, bombardier on a B-29 flying incendiary missions over Tokyo, later described the disconnection. "We dropped bombs from 6 miles up. Sometimes cloud cover hid the ground completely. We saw flashes, maybe smoke rising through clouds, but the devastation, the people burning, we couldn't see that from 30,000 feet. It felt abstract, almost like a training mission where you aim at coordinates rather than consequences." The altitude advantage created psychological distance matching physical distance. At 30,000 feet, nearly 6 miles above ground, human eyes couldn't resolve individual buildings, couldn't distinguish military facilities from residential neighborhoods, couldn't see people dying beneath formations that cruised untouched through clear sky while cities burned below. Pressurized cabins compounded the disconnection. Crews operated in shirt-sleeve comfort, maintaining normal conversation, drinking coffee, monitoring instruments without oxygen masks restricting movement. The contrast with Japanese pilots fighting hypoxia in unpressurized cockpits at extreme altitude was stark. But it also isolated American crews from the visceral reality of what their bombs achieved. Ground combat soldiers saw consequences immediately. Enemy soldiers falling, buildings collapsing, civilians fleeing. Naval aviators conducting torpedo runs or dive-bombing attacks operated close enough to witness destruction. But B-29 crews dropping bombs from 6 miles high experienced warfare at remove that felt almost theoretical until reconnaissance photographs revealed cities reduced to ash. Not all crew members struggled with moral implications. Many defended their actions with arguments rooted in strategic necessity and proportional ethics. Captain Robert Lewis, co-pilot on Enola Gay, later wrote, "We shortened the war. The bombs we dropped, including the atomic weapons, saved American lives that would have been lost invading Japan. Intelligence projected 1 million Allied casualties for Operation Downfall. Against that, strategic bombing killing hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians represented tragic but justifiable choice. The mathematics of military necessity provided framework for rationalization. Every month the Pacific War continued. Thousands died. American soldiers, Japanese soldiers, Asian civilians in occupied territories, Allied prisoners in Japanese camps. Strategic bombing offered path to end the war faster than invasion or blockade alone. If B-29 raids shortened the war by months, they saved more lives than they took. But the altitude advantage that enabled that calculus troubled others. Major Charles Sweeney, pilot of Boxcar, described post-war reflection. We had technological superiority so complete that Japanese defenses couldn't touch us at operational altitude. We could bomb with near impunity. Does that make what we did more justified because we could accomplish it safely, or less justified because they couldn't fight back effectively? I don't know. I've spent decades not knowing. Corporal Tanaka Hiroshi survived the war. American occupation forces recovered his diary along with thousands of other Japanese military documents. The entries captured frustration of defenders facing technological obsolescence. August 10, 1945, we fired until gun barrels overheated. Shells burst below like fireworks at festival. The enemy flew at a height we could not reach. Our courage was insufficient, not because we lacked warrior spirit, but because physics rendered our weapons useless against targets, operating in atmospheric zones we couldn't engage. They bombed with impunity, not because they were braver, but because their engineering was superior. The admission struck at fundamental assumptions about warfare. Victory didn't necessarily require greater courage, better tactics, or stronger will. Sometimes it required better engineering, pressurized cabins, supercharged engines, specifications that created 4,000-foot altitude gap defenders couldn't bridge, regardless of determination. The moral implications remained unresolved as post-war years brought jet aircraft operating at even higher altitudes. B-47 Stratojets could cruise at 40,000 feet. B-52 Stratofortresses reached 50,000 feet. Strategic missiles eliminated need for manned bombers entirely, delivering nuclear weapons from trajectories no defensive system could intercept. The altitude advantage became a permanent feature of modern warfare. And with it, the psychological distance that altitude created. Attacking from atmospheric zones where defenders couldn't respond, dropping weapons from heights where consequences remained abstract until reconnaissance revealed devastation, winning wars through technological superiority that rendered enemy defenses obsolete regardless of courage or skill. Some B-29 veterans found peace with their wartime service. Others carried guilt that no rationalization could ease. Most existed somewhere between, recognizing both the strategic necessity of what they'd done and the human cost of technological advantage that enabled systematic destruction from altitudes where consequences felt abstract until cities burned below. The B-29's altitude advantage had won the Pacific War. But whether that represented progress in warfare or moral regression remained question without comfortable answer, thus growing more urgent as jet aircraft and strategic missiles extended the principle further. Operating beyond reach, delivering devastation, winning through engineering advantage that made courage and determination irrelevant compared to altitude specifications measured in feet that might as well have been miles. Chapter 9. Beyond Reach. The B-29's altitude advantage had won the Pacific War. But whether that represented progress in warfare or moral regression remained question without comfortable answer, growing more urgent as jet aircraft and strategic missiles extended the principle further. Operating beyond reach, delivering devastation, winning through engineering advantage that made courage and determination irrelevant compared to altitude specifications measured in feet that might as well have been miles. Present day. The Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center near Washington Dulles International Airport houses. Enola Gay and climate-controlled display beside the observation tower. Visitors walk beneath the 141-foot wingspan, necks craned upward, cameras capturing polished aluminum skin that reflects overhead lighting. Children ask parents what the plaques mean. Adults read technical specifications with mixture of awe and discomfort. Service ceiling, 31,850 feet. Cruise speed, 220 miles per hour. Maximum bomb load, 20,000 pounds. Pressurized crew compartments. 4 Wright R-3350 engines, 8,800 combined horsepower. The numbers seem modest now. Commercial airliners cruise at 35 to 45,000 feet. Regional jets fly faster than the Superfortress's maximum speed. Modern cargo aircraft carry payloads 5 times greater. The specifications that rendered Japanese defenses obsolete in 1944 wouldn't impress contemporary aerospace engineers reviewing performance data. But context transforms numbers into history. In 1944, those specifications represented insurmountable technological advantage. The 4,000-foot gap between Japanese anti-aircraft effective ceiling and B-29 operational altitude determined the Pacific War's final chapter as decisively as any naval battle or ground campaign. 700 miles southwest at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, Boxcar occupies honored position in the National Museum of the United States Air Force's World War II gallery. The aircraft that dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki rests on polished floor, restoration work having returned it to August 1945 appearance. Plaques explain the silver plate modifications, the plutonium implosion weapon, the mission profile. Visitors photograph the bomb bay, imagining the moment Captain Kermit Behan released 10,800 pounds that would kill 40,000 people instantly. Some visitors defend the decision. Shortened the war, saved lives that invasion would have cost. Others question the morality, intentionally targeting civilians, accepting mass casualties as strategic necessity. The aircraft offers no answers, only specifications and historical fact. At Pima Air Museum near Tucson, Arizona, Sentimental Journey, a B-29 restored to flight status, sits on the ramp where volunteers maintain Wright R-3350 engines that still run, pressurization systems that still function, remote-controlled gun turrets that still traverse. The aircraft participates in air shows, demonstrating capabilities that once dominated Pacific skies. Modern audiences watch with appreciation tinged by knowledge of what those capabilities enabled. The museums preserve more than aircraft. They preserve questions without comfortable answers. Did the altitude advantage represent military genius? Innovative engineering creating decisive capability that shortened brutal war? Or did it represent moral regression? Technology enabling systematic destruction of cities from heights where defenders couldn't respond? Where attackers operated safely while hundreds of thousands died below? The B-29 established principle that defines modern air power. Operate beyond enemy reach, deliver devastating force, minimize friendly casualties. Every military aircraft developed since reflects that doctrine. Stealth technology makes aircraft invisible to defensive radar. Precision weapons eliminate need for mass bombing. Cruise missiles strike from ranges where interception becomes impossible. Drones operate remotely, removing even the theoretical risk to aircrews. The altitude gap has widened from 4,000 feet to absolute invulnerability. Modern air power operates beyond reach, not through pressurized cabins and supercharged engines, but through stealth, speed, standoff weapons, and remote operation. The psychological distance that troubled some B-29 crews, dropping bombs from 6 miles high, has extended to drone operators conducting strikes from control stations 8,000 miles from targets. Whether this represents progress depends on perspective. For military planners, the evolution from B-29 to B-2 stealth bomber to MQ-9 Reaper drone demonstrates continuous improvement in effectiveness while reducing friendly casualties. For ethicists, it represents growing disconnect between attackers operating in perfect safety and civilians dying in conflicts where technological superiority eliminates meaningful defense. Corporal Tanaka Hiroshi's diary entry, "The enemy flew at a height we could not reach," captured frustration that extends beyond one war. Every conflict since 1945 has featured similar asymmetries. Advanced militaries operate beyond reach of adversaries lacking equivalent technology. Precision weapons strike from distances where interception is impossible. The principle the B-29 pioneered has become permanent feature of modern warfare. The aircraft preserved in museums represent technological triumph and moral complexity that remains unresolved. Visitors who walk beneath Enola Gay's wingspan confront both the engineering achievement that created decisive military advantage and the human consequences of technology enabling destruction from heights, where consequences felt abstract until reconnaissance photographs revealed devastation. The B-29's 141-foot wingspan carried bombs that killed hundreds of thousands. Its 31,850-foot service ceiling created gap Japanese defenses couldn't bridge. Its pressurized cabins allowed crews to operate comfortably while cities burned 6 miles below. The specifications that seem modest by contemporary standards represented overwhelming advantage in 1944-1945. And the principle those specifications established: operate beyond reach, deliver force enemies cannot counter, win through technological superiority rendering courage and determination secondary to engineering specifications, defines warfare into the 21st century and beyond. The museums preserve the aircraft. But the questions persist. Does safety for attackers through technological advantage represent military progress? Does rendering enemy defenses obsolete through engineering represent legitimate victory? Do precision weapons delivered from altitudes or distances where interception is impossible make warfare more humane or less? The B-29s offer no answers. They simply stand as testament to moment when altitude measured in feet created advantage measured in total victory, when pressurized cabins and supercharged engines enabled both strategic bombing campaign that devastated 67 Japanese cities and atomic weapons that ended the war. Visitors leave museums having encountered history. What they take from that encounter: appreciation for engineering excellence, discomfort with technological warfare's moral implications, or some combination of both, depends on questions each person carries into the exhibit hall and out again into a world where modern aircraft operate at altitudes and ranges that make the B-29's 4,000-foot advantage seem quaint. But the principle remains: beyond reach, beyond response. Victory through altitude advantage that began with Boeing engineers designing pressurized cabins in Seattle and culminated in mushroom clouds rising over Japanese cities from bombers. Flying where defenders could only watch shells burst uselessly thousands of feet below formations operating in atmospheric zones. Physics wouldn't allow them to engage. The altitude gap determined the Pacific War, and variations of that gap define warfare still.